Hey everybody, RL 241, lesson 2 for week 2. Just moments ago finished recording the first lecture for this week. And we're going to kind of jump ahead. We're jumping over to World War II. Again, we have a lot of stuff to cover. And I want to look at what happens after World War II, and specifically the way American understandings of kind of religion gets tied up with American understandings of Americanness and the nation and national identity. So that's where we're headed. Today's topics, we're going to talk about post-war prosperity, Cold War religion, and then we're going to wrap it up by looking at the Catholic President John F. Kennedy and Vatican II together at the end. I'm hoping this is going to be a shorter lecture than the last one, but we'll see. So post-war prosperity. So after World War II, the United States in the 1950s, late 40s into the 50s, has reached this great economic prosperity. There's this kind of peacetime unity between Protestants, Catholics, and Jews. You see on the left-hand side of the screen, Will Herberg, who is a sociologist, publishes this book, Protestant, Catholic, Jew. I love that cover. It's a beautiful cover. In which he basically argues that the country has become this tri-faith America, as other scholars have called it, and that the old divisions have kind of fallen away, and that America is now united, Protestants, Catholics, and Jews together. You also see incredibly high rates of religious affiliation during this period. So there's peacetime prosperity, there is economic prosperity, there are this sort of tri-faith America. There is email coming through. And there's also a kind of beginnings of what we might think of as a prosperity religion. So Norman Vincent Peale, I love this. This is a great. The book covers in this period. The book covers in this period were lovely. I love this book cover. Power of Positive Thinking was published in 1952, and Peale, who was a minister at a church in New York, actually the church that President Trump grew up in was Norman Vincent Peale's church in New York. But Peale offered a kind of he's the one that coined this idea of the power of positive thinking. And in his book, he argued that if you change your attitude, if you change the way you think, you can change your life. And you can bring yourself prosperity, and you can bring yourself positivity and health. I don't know if you can hear the amazing song my dishwasher's playing. And so there was this emphasis not on individual salvation, not on God as out there to save you and take you to heaven, but as God wanting to take care of you and heal you and give you things and bring you prosperity. And that the way you found that was through keeping your thoughts positive, that your thoughts have power. And this is drawing on a long tradition that we didn't have time to talk about, going all the way back to the New Thought movement of the 1900s. But this is the right kind of Christianity for this moment. A moment where there is prosperity, so why not focus on the way you can be prosperous through your thoughts, and that God wants to make you prosperous, right? And this is the beginning of what will become down the line, we're not there yet, become known as the prosperity gospel down the line. So there's even a kind of prosperity religion happening in this period, right? It's also the period, though, of the Cold War. And so let's talk about some Cold War religion. Billy Graham, who you read, page 501, represents one version of this Cold War religion. Now, we could talk about Graham in lots of ways. Billy Graham was a famous revivalist, if you don't know. He had these huge meetings, what he called crusades, where he'd fill up football stadiums and baseball stadiums and arenas all over the country. He was an incredibly good speaker, rose to popularity in the 50s, had a radio show in the 50s, and really becomes a kind of symbol of a certain kind of individualistic, revivalistic, what some would call evangelical. He began to call himself an evangelical, and he called himself an evangelist first, but would eventually become known as sort of evangelical Christianity in this period. And if you look on 501 and 502, he discusses, he's talking about Christianity and communism. And he makes this comparison one-to-one. Like, for example, at the bottom of 501, he says, Christianity has a Bible, and so does communism in its manifests. Christianity demands repentance from sin. Communism demands a confession on the part of new converts. Christianity demands the acceptance of certain doctrines. So does communism, right? And he goes on and asks at the end of that piece, at the end of that section, the last paragraph on 502, what a challenge this should be to every Christian. Who is greater, Marx or Christ? Graham would emphasize this individual decision. He'd famously say, like, make a decision today. And he famously have the hymn, I have decided to follow Jesus, played at his rallies, but as revivals. But I think in this context, it's important to note the way that Graham represents Christianity as an American, foundational American ideal over and against communism, and specifically which represents Russia. So in the 50s, the beginning of the Cold War, Graham is tying up Christianity, American identity, American nationalism. By nationalism, we mean nationalism is when you begin to think of your identity in terms of your nation state, right? So as an American first. And he begins to blend these together. He begins to blend nationalism and Christianity, Americanism and Christianity. So that Christian America versus atheistic Russia. And he sees communism as the threat to Christianity that mirrors the way Russia the Soviet Union is a threat to America. And that's what's undergirding this, right? It's a nationalist, and it's a very masculine nationalism, and there's a lot of time we could spend on this. But he's one example of this. The other example is President Dwight Eisenhower, right? Who comes in as president during this period, who oversees all of this. He adds under God to the Pledge of Allegiance. He adds in God we trust to the money and the stamps as the national motto. That's all new in this period, and it's directly, in God we trust especially, is directly in counter to the godless, so-called godless atheists of communist Soviet Union. So we trust in God, America trusts in God, these Soviet Union trusts in communism, in nothing, right? There's a quote, this is a quote from Eisenhower I put down here because I think it sums up his view, which is not nearly as specific as Billy Graham's, that, quote, our form of government has no sense unless it is founded in a deeply felt religious faith, and I don't care what it is. With us, of course, it is the Judeo-Christian concept, but it must be a religion with all men are created equal. So for Eisenhower, and he says this in a couple places, tells everyone in America to go to church, he doesn't care where they go, right? Just go somewhere. When he becomes president, he actually decides he needs to be a Christian of some sort and actually talks to Billy Graham, and Billy Graham kind of looks at him and says, you seem like you'd be a good Presbyterian. And so on Billy Graham's advice, he gets baptized as a Presbyterian. So Eisenhower, I think, also harkens back to the Protestant Catholic Jew. This Judeo-Christian language is new. This is when it starts taking effect in this period. But this idea that Protestants, Catholics, and Jews all share a monotheistic God, which is something that holds them together as American over and against communist Russia, communist Soviet Union, godless, atheistic Soviet Union, right? And this becomes, so it's not just about religion, it's about national identity. Okay. This also produces a lot of unity, especially among the mainline churches. Now, our fundamentalists are still kind of hanging out. You have Billy Graham, who's no longer a fundamentalist, right? Who no longer uses that word. And so the mainline, the modernist churches, what becomes known as the mainline churches or the liberal Protestant churches, they become, with this word here, ecumenism, right? This churches working together. And so they form, in 1908, they first formed the Federal Council of Churches. Then in 1950, they formed this National Council of Churches, which you read a piece from. And again, it reflects a unity and a vision of America as its role in the world as a superpower over and against Russia. And when you read that document, you can see when it says the council stands for liberty with the richest content. It's on page 520. It stands for freedom of men to be as the Lord God meant them to be. It stands for Christian freedom, including the freedom to pursue happiness and with justice and sympathy to create conditions of happiness for others. This emphasis of freedom, these very American nationalist ideas, right? And also on 521, the council give thanks to God for all those forces which make for harmony in our society. When, for example, science employs its ingenuity to knit the world together in bonds of communication. When business and industry make a like contribution to the life-bringing mutuality of commerce. When the arts depict the beauty and the tragedy of our existence, right? They go on to talk about this. So they see themselves here. This is an extension of that modernist stuff we just talked about. I just talked about 10 minutes ago, but you read earlier this week, right? And it's a combining that with a kind of America's role in the world, right? This is also, they'll be followed after this. There'll be a World Council of Churches that's global, but they see themselves. It's deeply nationalist. They see themselves. They talk about the soul of the nation, the churches as the soul of the nation. Now, at the same time, and I didn't spend a lot of time on this, there's also the founding in the same period, a little bit earlier, in fact, of the National Association of Evangelicals as a kind of counter to the FCC and then the NCC. So that's beginning to happen, but it's not nearly as big and not nearly as politically powerful and culturally powerful as the National Council of Churches. And there's this emphasis on trying to address social problems around the world. As they say at the end, let nation and nation, race and race, class and class unite their arms in this broad purposes for man. And out of that unitedness, there will arise new strength like that of which ourselves already feel the first sure intimation. So here, all of these churches, Methodists, Presbyterians, the Liberal Baptists, all of the mainline churches, not the fundamentalists, right, forming together to work together on these things. So that unity reflects the larger unity you see between Catholics and Jews and Protestants, which reflects the larger American nationalist identity over and against Russia, the Soviet Union. So this kind of, I think, hits its climax with John F. Kennedy's election and as the first Catholic president. There was other Catholic presidential candidates in the past who lost. But Kennedy, who I gave you the speech to read, on 545, and he made us. This is the speech I gave you is one that he gave to the press club in Washington D.C. Society of American Newspaper Editors. The one that I think is more interesting, if you go on YouTube, you can find it. It's his speech to Houston to the Ministerial Association there in September, right before the election in 1960. And both speeches are pretty much the same. He, as you see here, he emphasizes a kind of separation. He says, for example, first of all, that he's not the Catholic candidate, right? He's the Democratic candidate who happens to be Catholic. As he says on 545, nor am I appealing, as is too often claimed, to a so-called Catholic vote. For even if such a vote exists, which I doubt, I want to make one thing clear: I want no vote solely on account of my religion. He goes on and says, neither do I want anyone to support my candidacy merely to prove that this nation is not bigoted and that a Catholic can be elected president. I've never suggested that those opposed to me are thereby anti-Catholic. So he goes on to talk about that, right? And he also talks about the idea that there should be a separation between religion and politics, that his politics and his religion are completely separated for him. He says on 546, would you as President of the United States be responsive in any way to ecclesiastical, so church, pressures or obligations of any kind that might in any fashion influence or interfere with your conduct of that office in the national interest? I've answered that question many times. My answer was and is no, right? So he goes on to say that that there's a separation, and he's countering a lot of long-standing anti-Catholic ideas that we've looked at just last week, of them being anti-democratic, of them only listening to the Pope. And in many ways, his election marks, to go back to 1950 and Protestant Catholic Jew, the effectiveness of this so-called Tri-Faith America, the effectiveness of the unity that happens after the war. It also reflects some larger changes in American Catholicism, where the Catholics who had immigrated in the 19th century, the Catholic neighborhoods and Catholic enclaves throughout the country, had their kids and their kids' kids had moved out, had moved to the suburbs. After World War II, you have the GI Bill, which allows so many Catholic kids who grew up in Catholic neighborhoods to go to college, and then they move to the suburbs. And now, in the suburbs, Catholics and Protestants and even Jews are living elbow to elbow. Not elbow to elbow, they have their big lawns in the suburbs, of course, but they're living driveway to driveway, right? In these neighborhoods, outside of the urban centers, outside of the urban neighborhoods that were Catholic neighborhoods or Jewish neighborhoods. And maybe they're going back on the holidays, right, for Passover and Easter and Christmas and whatever to visit the grandparents, but they don't live there anymore, right? And so the kind of suburbanization, the higher education gained by second, third, fourth generation Catholic and Jewish immigrants, kids, opens up a whole different world that you start to see that Kennedy's election is a kind of symbolic moment for, in a lot of ways. And the idea that in the midst of the Cold War, that his Christianity, whether it's Catholic Christianity or not, his Christianity is still important, and that religion and that religiosity and that being a religious person is still super important for the national identity going into the midst of the Cold War. We also see another big change that opens up Catholicism in America more is the Vatican II, Vatican II was a meeting called by the Pope John the 23rd, you see there on the left, of everyone at the Vatican to reassess the state of the church and to reassess and deal with some problems that he saw in the church and to move the church forward. The Second Vatican Council, the formal name is the Second Vatican Council. It's this big church council. One American who makes a very important contribution is John Courtney Murray. He writes the Declaration on Religious Liberty, which, again, one of the big critiques we saw in the 19th century, early 20th century was that Catholics are anti-religious liberty. And he wrestles with that. And as an American who's been thinking about questions of religious liberty for Catholics in America, he's primed to deal with this. Other changes that you see, there's a whole mess of them. We don't have time to cover it in the 2 minutes I'm going to talk about it here. But you see the vernacular Mass. So Mass is no longer in Latin, but can be in whatever language around the world that is spoken, right? There's a new openness to working with Protestants. And there's also now the church that had officially and formally blamed the Jews for killing Jesus and had led to all sorts of anti-Semitism in the history of the church and the history of Europe and all these other things, finally comes to the defense and defends the Jews against these attacks and against those sorts of notions. So some big changes, and I hit on these three because the vernacular Mass now opens up the church around the world in very interesting ways. But then the openness to Protestants and the defense of the Jews shows the way that that in America has a huge impact in building continuing the bonds of this tri-faith, this Protestant Catholic Jew moment of the early 60s, or that started in the 50s and now going into the early 60s. So this is a much shorter lecture. I'm sure you're happy for that. But the point I wanted to bring home here really is that in this Cold War period, American national identity gets tied up with religion and with just a kind of general religiousness, right? That tends to be Jewish and Christian, right? And we'll see that changes we don't have large-scale immigration from other countries at this point yet, right? And it's also very white, I think, to pay attention to, right? There's a lot of people a lot of African Americans who do not have access to the prosperity that we're talking about here, and we'll talk about them in a little bit, like next week, who have a different view during this same period and put pressure on Kennedy during the Civil Rights Movement of the 60s and Johnson after him. And so one way to think about it is going up to Kennedy is this Kennedy's election can be seen as the end cap to this peaceful, prosperous period that was peaceful and prosperous because there was no civil rights movement yet, because the South still had Jim Crow, because suburbia was white, and because so many Jews at this point were now considered white by most people. So there were a lot of people who, in this lovely picture of Protestant Catholic Jew, this lovely picture of America standing against communism, who are kept out of the picture. And we're going to see what happens when they assert themselves. Kennedy's election can mark a shift because we'll have after that Kennedy's assassination, the civil rights movement, King's assassination, Robert Kennedy's assassination, all hell breaks loose the last half of in the 60s, and lots of cultural change happens all of a sudden. And in fact, it's this period we're talking about right now of a kind of undifferentiated Judeo-Christian tri-faith America that so many people today point back to as the good old days. If we want to take the claim to make America great again seriously, this is the America they're thinking about. But there's very particular things happening in this period and people who are left out of it that we'll see going forward. All right, that's a very much shorter lecture. I'm going to try to keep these shorter because I know you don't want to watch a half hour anymore. Much shorter lecture on the American way, right? And the way religion functions as a part of national identity in this way. I hope you all are safe. Hang in there. If you need anything, shoot me an email. And hope you stay well. And we'll keep on trucking through this week. Take care.